All right, so we are officially live, and welcome everyone. Welcome back to the Sunken Blimp stage. It's an honor having you all here on this beautiful Friday. We have today a very special presentation, which is going to be hosted by Kyla Scanlon, and she is an amazing person. So, for those that don't know, Kyla, she's a content creator and founder within the financial education spaces, and she's joined the Sunken Bloom community for a conversation around the concept of the recent run-ups in fertilizer prices, food shortages, and modern finance. In her presentation about the interconnectedness between fertilizer, food, and finance. So, thank you so much, Kyla, for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I'm Kyla, and I'm going to talk about food insecurity and finance today, and really get into, broadly speaking, like what that looks like and what it means and sort of why it's happening, and also talk about the baby formula shortage for those who aren't in the United States. There's a very big baby formula shortage problem here, and it's sort of a poor example of, whoa, okay, like, can everybody mute themselves, please? Thanks. Okay. And I think there's some slides at the front of the screen, so I'm gonna be flipping through those. Yeah, so I want to talk about the age of scarcity, which is a term that Bloomberg developed, and I think other researchers have developed, but that's sort of a core component of what I'm going to be talking about. And then food systems, some core inputs, so talking about oil, fertilizer. Oh no, please don't like touch the slides. Core inputs, fertilizer, and then the compound impact, as well as the baby formula shortage and potential solutions. And yeah, please don't touch the slides because everybody can see when you do that. Don't do that, please. This is or I guess like by me saying that there might be incentive to do that, but please don't. Okay. All right. So the age of scarcity. So this is a term developed by Bloomberg. So as everybody knows, there has been a pandemic for the past 2 years, as well as a war in Ukraine caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And part of this problem, or some of these problems have persisted for a while, but they've been exacerbated by these two things that I just mentioned. So a lot of things are not working the way that they had been over the past 10 years since the pandemic began, and now Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made all of that worse. And so, kind of what's happening from a really high level is that there's lower growth and a lack of production from the supply chain issues, from domestic protectionism, from rising energy costs, from natural disasters, and from wartime sanctions. So the supply chain issues are largely a product of the pandemic, but that was sort of existing beforehand as well, with just a lot of tense global relations. And then domestic protectionism is largely a byproduct of don't touch the slides, please. Is largely a product of the war in Russia, and then just sort of these like geopolitical divides that are happening with China, Saudi Arabia, etc. And then rising energy costs that's also been compounded by the war in Russia and Ukraine. But has been existing for a while, just because everybody is trying to potentially transition to renewables, but there's still a large reliance on oil. Natural disasters. So the world is in a little bit of a disarray because of climate devastation, and that has compounded a lot of the problems that we face. And then wartime sanctions, largely a product of Russia, but also has happened to Iran, etc. And all of that leads to more inflation and shortages. So this chart on the right-hand side of the graph is from Bloomberg, and you can see that global GDP has been cut. So economic growth has been cut because of the war in Ukraine, because of the China lockdowns, because of the pandemic at large. And then inflation has really spiked. It's actually gone down a little bit in terms of projections, but huge spikes in inflation. And that's largely because energy has gotten so expensive because of countries beginning to do domestic protectionism, so not really wanting to import as much as they used to, as well as supply chain issues in these natural disasters and other wartime sanctions. So on the next slide, sort of the question that comes from this is like a chicken or the egg problem. So which came first, right? Like supply chain issues or the pandemic? And obviously the pandemic exacerbated supply chain problems, but all of this stuff sort of compounds within itself. So supply chain issues are made worse by the pandemic because of a lack of labor, because of shutdowns. It's also made worse by the war in Ukraine, because obviously there's a war going on in Europe, so it's very difficult to get things to where they need to go. And then domestic protectionism. So one could argue that that sort of began back in the Trump era when tariffs were placed on China, and China sort of responded in turn as well. So there's been a lot of nation states being like, we just need to protect ourselves, and we're seeing like almost deglobalization happen because of that. And then rising energy costs. So like I was talking about earlier, largely like Europe was trying to rotate over to renewables, but it's really difficult to rotate over to renewables if you're not properly invested in renewables, and you can't really support your country on renewables alone. So you're still really reliant on gas and oil from Russia. And so if all of a sudden Russia invades another country, that's going to make it super difficult for you to get the energy that you need. And so that's exacerbated there. Then natural disasters. So like crazy things just keep on happening. Like India is going through a massive heat wave. India was supposed to be a huge wheat supplier, in terms of like sort of this gap that has been caused by Ukraine and Russia, who are also huge wheat suppliers. India was supposed to fill up some of that gap that was happening as a result of the supply chain issues, as a result of the war. And so you can kind of see like that all of these things make everything else worse, which makes a lot of sense. But it's just a good example, or it's sort of it's just another thing to pay attention to, where it's like, okay, if one thing keeps on happening, like these dominoes are going to keep on tipping. Please don't touch the slides. All right. And so, but I guess that was helpful. So thank you, actually. The pieces are going missing. So, I mean, the way that you can kind of think about the world is puzzle pieces. So everything kind of fits into where it needs to go, especially over the past 10 years, since the early 2000s, we've become really globalized. And the way that the world has worked is sort of on this just in time inventory process with pretty like relatively rickety supply chains and global trade. So everybody was able to rely on everybody else for everything, because we were like, okay, we're just going to vibe, it's going to be fine, things are going to be good. But now, because of the war, because of the pandemic, because of just shortages and inflation, you're going to start to see realignment along political lines, both domestically and globally, a little bit of reshoring, reallocation of resources, and a reevaluation of priorities for all countries. And this quote at the bottom, in a globalized world, everything impacts everyone. So you can think that like, oh, something happening in this country over here is not going to impact me. But because of the just-in-time world that we have, everything sort of impacts everybody. And because we're so reliant on a global perspective from, inputs from other nations, from that production process in other nations, it really just makes everything a little bit worse and harder to manage. All right, so the changing global order. So Zoltan has written a lot about this. I don't really know how to pronounce it. Zoltan Pozar, I think is his last name, but he is an analyst at Credit Suisse, a strategist at Credit Suisse, and he's written a lot about this. A lot of people have written a lot about this. Like people are like, oh gosh, it's been relatively good for so long, and it kind of seems like things are going to have to shift, because that's just how things largely work. So the lockdowns were a big component of that. So as China and their COVID zero policy, that really makes it difficult for them to import and export, or really export things to other nations. And they're such a huge exporter, so that creates quite a few problems there. And then the supply chains crack due to labor shortages. And so you just see that across the board, where countries are not able to get things to where they need to go, and then things don't go to where they need to go. And that just creates like this whole domino effect, which I feel like I'm going to say a lot during this presentation, but it just creates this whole domino effect of impact, where if you were like relying on a semiconductor for an iPhone production, and that semiconductor isn't able to be produced because ASML, the producer up in the Netherlands is not able to get the components that they need, all of a sudden that iPhone is not able to be produced just because the semiconductor wasn't able to be produced. And so it's like that with everything. Like, for example, like if you're not able to get the flour for the bread that you need to produce, you're not going to be able to make sandwiches. And so it's just kind of that compounding process that creates a lot of issues with lockdowns. And then deglobalization is sort of like a core theme of what's going on potentially. So sanctions are a huge component of that. Those have sort of dissipated over the past few weeks. They were quite intense to begin with, but I think Russia has actually produced more oil than expected, and has sent it to countries like India, etc. Please don't touch the slides. And then government stockpiling. So you're starting to see countries begin to stockpile goods, and that's going to create even more inflationary pressures and sort of this deglobalization aspect too, where people are going to be like, oh, I can't help you out because I need to have all this stuff for myself, because we've been in this protectionist mindset for so long, where it's kind of like anything that will go wrong can go wrong. Please don't touch the slides. And yeah, so then new trade relations. So you're going to start to see countries begin to develop new relationships with one another or fall out of relationships. A lot of people think that China is going to take center stage. I think that they have a lot of pressure from COVID zero in their own property market and just a lot of, their own dominoes going on there. So I don't think that's going to quite happen, but I do think that you're going to see new trade relationships form from this. And then global tensions. So roughly $6 trillion of goods flow between autocracy. I always mispronounce that, but autocracies and democracies. And so I think that with the invasion of Russia and Ukraine, that is going to really, it's already calling into question sort of how countries think about their trade relationships and their partners. All right, so comparative advantage. So kind of what I've been describing this entire time is comparative advantage. So country specialization. So countries often specialize in one thing because they're good at that. And then they can trade with other countries that are good at other things. So if you're really good at producing bread and another country is really good at producing, I'm trying to think of an example, like water, that's a terrible example. Like towels. So like one country is really good at producing towels, another country is really good at producing bread. You're going to do trade between each other. So that way you can produce more bread, they can produce more towels, and you're just more efficient. However, if they were like, Allah, we don't want to give you any more bread anymore, you're going to have to start producing your own bread in addition to your own towels. And that is just more expensive in general, and it's just not as efficient. And you have to have more labor for that. You have to have more resources for that. And so it really just creates a whole problem at large for countries that normally relied on relatively strong relationships between each other. And so there's consequences obviously that come from that. So this is the idea of domestic protectionism again, where nations are like, I'm going to protect myself and not you, and I'm going to just make sure that everything I do is within my own borders. That's an element of isolationism, which is not good from a global growth perspective, and it's also not good from a domestic growth perspective. But we're starting to see here, I'm from the United States, here in the United States, you're starting to see that a little bit more. Secretary Yellen pointed out that they're going to do trade with friends. She is the Treasury Secretary here. And what's a friend? Like, what does that mean? And so you can sort of imply what it means, like democratic nations that are not doing trade with Russia right now. And if all of a sudden, the United States, which normally, for example, just a terrible example, but if they normally import a lot of bread, all of a sudden we're going to have to start to make our own bread and our own towels. And that's going to be more expensive from an inflationary perspective and more expensive just from a efficiency perspective. Reduces productivity, reduces trade, and will likely lead to higher tensions between countries. Yeah, please don't touch the slides. All right, and so what are the compounding causes? So I talked about some core causes just then, but some compounding causes is obviously the pandemic, so that, it has not gone away, and now there's monkeypox, whatever that means for the world. So global lockdowns create both a labor and production shortage, which continues to persist, and that creates a lot of problems, especially China and their COVID zero policy, and then just shutting down periodically is just not good from a growth perspective. And I think the stat came out today that for the first time in a while, the United States is expected to outgrow China, which you just wouldn't have thought would happen. But it's because of that policy. But of course, that policy reverberates down the supply chain and impacts all the nations that are reliant on China as a trade partner. And then a lack of investment. So one thing I say a lot in my work, I make finance content. That's my job, by the way. But just like you can't have green energy policy without green energy investment, you can't have any sort of policy without money. So like I spoke about a little bit earlier with Europe and their reliance on renewables, and then all of a sudden they were secretly really reliant on oil and gas from Russia, but they were like, oh no, we're switching to renewables, wink wink. But they didn't have the proper policy in place, the proper investment in place in order to really get those renewables off the ground. And that's sort of like what we're seeing across the board here is with food, which I'm going to get into, with everything, semiconductors, I think I say that wrong, but semiconductors, all that stuff. You just see a lack of investment and a lack of sustainability in terms of how we do it, which creates just like how are you going to fix that? And then monetary policy, I'm going to talk about this as well, but fiscal and monetary policy, rightly so, was super easy during the pandemic. Easy meaning that they were like, hey, everybody, don't worry, like we're going to step in, support the market. You're going to get some sort of stimulus check if you make under a certain amount. Like we're going to make sure that this time of fear doesn't sort of wreck everybody. But now you're starting to see that pull back. You're starting to see the world reopen. And there's an inflationary bullwhip effect because of that, where people were able to save a lot, during 2 years of being locked inside their house. And now it's like, well, I'm going to go spend. And so you see that reflected in new car prices. You see that reflected in home buying. You see that reflected across the board. I think personally with home buying, I think a lot of people just don't want to be in the pandemic house that they were in because you spent so much time in there. And I also think a lot of millennials are aging into the housing market. A lot of boomers have a lot of wealth stored up. So you're just seeing a huge demand across the board there. Geopolitics. So like I was talking about a little bit earlier, there's this tension that's sort of coming to head, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a great example of that, where you're just starting to see these tensions really begin to be enacted upon or acted upon, and it's not good. Like Sweden or some two countries joined NATO, Finland and I think Sweden, and you're just starting to see like party lines begin to be drawn at a global stage. All right, and so next, so yeah, like all this stuff kind of goes into itself, right? So what's going on from a broad perspective? So if somebody was like, what's happening? Like it's largely the supply chain issues, it's domestic protectionism, it's rising energy costs, it's natural disasters, it's these wartime sanctions, and that's all compounded, or is it chicken and egg wise, by the pandemic, by sheer lack of investment by the government, by regulatory bodies, by even private companies, I would argue, and then monetary policy and geopolitics. So all this stuff like feeds into itself. So it's sort of this like non-virtuous feedback loop where it's really difficult to get away from it because it just keeps on compounding itself, and because of these different variables, and all of them are so impactful because of the way that we've set up the world for the past, however many years or so. And so right now, obviously, there is, right now, there is a war happening. And this gets into what I'm going to be talking about with food, but there's a quote that was like, Ukraine is a country of, I think, 400 million people. I can't remember the exact number, sorry. But like, they're a country of X number of people, but they feed X to the N more people than they have within their own nation. So they are essentially the breadbasket of the world. They feed so many people. A lot of countries are reliant on Ukraine, such as Egypt, Middle East and Africa nations are reliant on Ukraine for their crops. And Russia is a huge component of this production as well. Belarus is a huge manufacturer of fertilizer. And so you just have these nations that are so important from a global sustainability of life perspective that are now not able to either sow their crops, they're not able to produce, they're not able to do the things that they need to do because of the war. And then supply chain bottlenecks. So I've talked about that a little bit, but like all of this is exacerbated by the pandemic, by labor shortages, by um, just boats not going where they need to go, and that's really difficult. Like I said, in terms of this just-in-time policy, in terms of being able to maintain that, and then weather. So all of this is compounded by droughts in the United States and South America. Impacting both the wheat and corn harvests. Like I said earlier, India is going through a massive heat wave. And so you're just seeing like all these sort of anomalies begin to play out, and because they're all playing out at the same time, it makes everything X amount worse. And then reproduction. So all of this is made worse by energy costs. So Brazil is diverting sugarcane production to ethanol, which is an energy source, and that'll not produce as much global sugar supply. So instead of making sugar with the sugarcane, they're like, we need ethanol, we need something, and you're starting to see that happen. And that divergence of resources creates other problems, like who's going to make more sugar now. And so it's all this stuff, like I said, sort of like circulating within itself, and it creates a lot of issues. All right, so food. Oops, sorry. Food under pressure. I'm gonna clear my throat super fast. Sorry. So food systems under pressure. So by 2050, global demand for food will be 56% higher than it was in 2010, and the world will need to feed 2 billion more people. So yeah, I mean, food demand is going to increase by over 56%, but one would argue that we're not sort of setting the global stage for 56% more production of food, but there's going to be 56% more mouths to feed. And that's going to be super difficult from a sustainability perspective. And it's going to be really important that we figure out how to do that, so we don't have the issues that we have today with, food insecurity. So what does that mean for food supply? So right now there's a lot of import dependency, and that means, like I was saying earlier, there's that idea of comparative advantage, where in a globalized world you can rely on other countries for inputs and core commodities. So kind of what I was saying, right? Like if you're not able to get sugar, like how are you going to produce your cookies? Or if you're not able to get flour, how are you going to produce your bread? And so you have countries that rely on these inputs so they can produce things that they are going to export or sell within their own borders. And if all of a sudden that goes away, that's a huge issue. And then there's also core commodities, so fertilizer, natural gas, etc. If all of that supply is at risk because of import dependency, that's super difficult. And then there's supply chain disruptions. So it's become increasingly difficult to get the necessary materials, and then climate conditions. So we're starting to see water scarcity, which is worse than droughts, because it's sort of like permanent. Please don't touch the slides, because it's kind of like permanent water scarcity, or permanent environmental degradation. And that's really difficult to, fix. And then there's a lack of farmable land, and that is sort of because of the way that we farmed historically is not as sustainable as it could have been, which, a lot of people didn't know any better, but there's better ways to farm, but a lot of land has already been sort of wrecked because of that. And then, yeah, that gets into the idea of the lack of sustainable production. So the way that we treat Earth now just can't continue. And I think there's a lot of really good arguments to be made on both sides of climate change, where you have some scientists that are like, oh, no, it's going to be okay. Like the Earth is regenerative, like it's, it'll sort itself out. But I think that broadly speaking, like we have to find ways to, help that out to make it a little bit more sustainable. Water scarcity is a huge issue, droughts, and then just these natural disasters that keep on happening because we sort of created like this balancing act of sticks. And if you pull one thing of the Jenga pile, if you pull one Jenga out of the Jenga pile, the whole thing topples over eventually. So what does that mean for how we think about resources? So most developed nations, I live in the United States, we're very used to a world where everything comes when needed, right? Like Amazon shipping 2 days, and people expect that, and they're not used to having shortages like emerging nations might face. And there's a lot of food waste. I think 1/3 of all food is actually wasted And that's pretty thoughtless. And so I think that there's going to have to be sort of a reckoning with that, where you're facing these elements of deglobalization, which, as I've talked about earlier, that's going to make it a little bit less efficient in terms of productivity, in terms of accessibility. Commodities are potentially going to become more powerful than the US dollar. This is something that Sultan Pulsar has written about. And essentially, the thesis there is that oil and natural gas and other things like that are going to be what countries end up relying on, because in times of turmoil like we're currently in, that is immensely valuable. And the US dollar can buy things, but if there's nothing to buy, right, like it's not as valuable as actually having like the physical capacity to have oil. And there's going to be a redrawing of power hierarchies. And so I think that, when you think about China, when you think about Russia, when you think about these global superpowers, potentially that could create a lot of redrawing in terms of how we think about who is sort of leading the world in what direction. And all of this impacts not only food sources, like all of this impacts not only the sources of food that we have, but semiconductors, raw materials, etc. So everything that is everything sort of gets impacted from a resource perspective, from a way that we sort of proceed right now. And then so the next slide. Uh, and then so some of the core inputs here, right? So like I've talked a lot about supply chains and I talked a lot about what's going on, but there's sort of these like baseline things that are super important. And one of those is water. Everybody needs water. Water scarcity is a huge problem. A lot of nations are facing that, and it's sort of this long-term problem, like I said, from the environment.
Oh yeah.
Uh, yeah, can you like mute yourself, please? From having environmental issues. And water is pretty necessary, right, for human life and production of all goods because of the climate impacts. And we are sort of at fault, obviously, because of irresponsible usage. And so now these supplies are potentially increasingly at risk. So next slide, another core input, as much as I personally don't like it, is oil. It's super frustrating that we're still so reliant on it, but oil is in everything, plastic products. The cars here in the United States are super reliant on oil, and heating homes essentially. So oil is still a huge, huge part of how we live our everyday lives, and energy in general is a baseline input to most processes. And so now Russia is a huge, exporter of oil. OPEC plus huge, like the cartel of oil and all of that is not great from a production perspective because they're not producing as much as they could. Well, they are. They're so it's sort of really difficult. Like the oil situation is super confusing and convoluted because OPEC plus cannot produce more, they say, because they're sort of at this spare capacity baseline. But there's also a financial incentive for them not to produce, right, when prices are super high, because like they make money when prices are super high. And so it's once again sort of this misalignment of incentives. The US also has misalignment of incentives. They're practicing capital discipline from a shale perspective. And so basically what that means is like back in 2014, if you're from the United States, you might remember the shale boom. And shale companies were like, yeah, produce all the shale. And they just burned a ton of cash. And so investors were like, you suck and you better make us our money back. And so now they're trying to do that for the investors, make that money back. But it's during an energy crisis that might not be the best use of resources. And so Iran and Venezuela are politicized sources of oil. So, I mean, it was a huge deal when Biden went down, the Biden administration went down to Venezuela. There was sort of renegotiation around the sanctions in Iran, but that could be a solution in terms of producing more oil. Obviously, the best solution one day is to not have oil, but we all know how politics work. So there's a lot of price volatility because of that, and oil is just super, super important from a core input perspective. And then fertilizer. So fertilizer is also really, really important. It produces most of the food in the world, or helps to. Russia is a large producer of the ingredients for fertilizer, as well as Russia is a big producer of wheat and other core inputs for production. And that's a dilemma for a lot of reasons, but like if you can think about food production as an equation, so fertilizer is sort of the thing that you need to have the equation be complete in order to even, produce some stuff in the first place. And if all of a sudden the fertilizer goes away, crop yields are sort of slashed, and it just becomes a little bit more difficult to produce the crops and the food that you need for people. And Belarus and Russia are about 35 to 40% of this fertilizer input market, and both of those countries are constrained from shipping because of the war. And so that's a huge issue from a food production perspective. And so on this next slide is the core inputs triangle. And so the way that I think about this is, please don't touch the slides. The way that I think about this is, what is it going to say? So this is not scientific. This is something I think about. I'm sure somebody else has a better triangle out there. But you have water at the bottom. So water is sort of like what everybody needs for producing things. Most processes require some element of water, and if the process doesn't require an element of water, the person doing the process or the machine might require some element of water. Oil is sort of that next core input where you need oil from a thing. Fertilizer, you need that to produce food. And then labor, like you need people. And so people are super important to this process. And obviously, I haven't talked enough about like the human perspective of all of this, but like because of the pandemic, because of the war, because of everything that's happened, labor has become scarce, and there was a labor shortage in the United States that's sort of normalizing now. But yeah, these are like the four core things that you can think about from an input perspective. Okay, whoops. Okay, yes. What can the government do? Okay, yeah. So like, what are some solutions, right? What can the government do? Regulation is a good step. More support to alternatives, so more support to renewable energy. Having some laws around lobbying would be a great step here in the United States. Sort of figuring out how much companies can donate to politicians and the ways that they donate and why are they donating, I think is super important, and just more insight into those laws there. Innovation funds, both from a private and public markets perspective. So instead of companies doing massive stock buybacks on the public markets perspective, like maybe a percentage of that money has to go into an innovation fund where they help fund, other companies that might be thinking about making the world more sustainable, might be thinking about food production, because you're not going to go to Apple, the tech company, and be like, you have to focus on making sure that we have more corn. Like that's just not something Apple is good at from that comparative advantage standpoint. But can Apple invest in and they have a venture arm, so they do, but like, can Apple invest more in sort of making sure that there's that optionality? Yes, they probably can. And then private markets. So, I mean, we're starting to see a huge shakeout in private markets right now where VCs, largely speaking, were a little bit, I don't know if I want to say reckless, but they were just a little bit interesting with the valuations that they were assigning companies, the way that they were thinking about, cash flow, the way that they were allocating money. So I think that you like seeing a little bit more investment in sort of like uh, these sorts of sustainability companies, companies that are focused on ag tech, for example, might be a good solution. And then get out of the way as the final option for the government to do. They can support innovation financially, but there is something to be said for the power of free markets. But there's also something to be said for the power of incentives, right? Like somebody who might not care about global food production could be financially incentivized to care about it a little bit more and invest in that space. So it's just about creating the right incentive framework in order to get people to do that thing. That's what governments can do, but should they do that? That's a whole different thing. But these are just some ideas. Okay. And so as a point to all of this, it is getting better. So as we talk about, what the government can do, we do see, this is a chart from JP Morgan on meat prices and chicken prices. You can see that the prices have gone down recently. They're still a little bit elevated, but they have gone down. So meat prices have decreased. Chicken prices have decreased. I think pork prices are still very, very high. Turkey prices are super high, actually. So it's not across the board that you're seeing perfect price destruction, but you are seeing a little bit of recovery there, which is super good because food is, everybody needs to have it. On this next slide, this is talking about the Federal Reserve. So as I was talking about, like, meat prices are recovering, chicken prices are recovering. Some of that is because of the policies sort of that the Federal Reserve has set in place. So for some backstory on the Fed swooped in during the pandemic and they were like, don't worry, stock market, don't worry, economy, like we're going to be here. We're going to make sure that things don't go under. Fiscal policy helps support people. And it just made sure that like things didn't explode. Because if the Fed had not stepped in, a lot of stuff would have exploded and it would have been really bad. But the problem was that the Fed kind of stuck around for a little bit too long. Like they stayed at the party a little bit too late into the night. And they didn't move on policy for several reasons, mostly because of their new framework and then a lack of leadership clarity. And I think this is like one of the most important points that is not brought up enough is that the Biden administration, the government, and not even the Biden administration, the government, the Senate, they did not appoint a Fed chair. They did not re-nominate Jerome Powell, who is the Fed chair, in a timely manner. There was a lot of delays behind it. And so that led to a delay in policy, and that led to a delay in the Fed moving on inflation. So because we saw such easy monetary policy, because we saw such liquidity flow into the markets, into the economy, people were psyched, and the stock market reflected that, and that created an unsustainable environment. And we saw after the pandemic lockdown was lifted, sort of we saw people begin to go spend on services. They begin to go buy things. They begin to go live their lives again. But part of that problem is that creates a lot of inflation because you create a lot of demand and you create a lot of things, or you create a lack of things, right? So like there's a lack of supply, but there's a ton of demand. That creates an inflationary environment. And because the Fed had provided so much liquidity, that was sort of a compounding factor there as well. So we're in this really inflationary environment everywhere right now because of the pandemic, post-pandemic demand, because of the excess liquidity potentially, and just because of that mismatch between supply and demand. Sorry if I said that. But so now we're kind of facing this demand destruction and these large inflationary pressures because of the Fed's policies. And they're like, oh, don't worry, we're going to like step in and we're going to wreck it essentially. And like, even if the stock market is so unhappy with them right now, but they're like, hey, listen, we have to fix inflation. That is part of our dual mandate. And so the market has gotten really complacent around the Fed, and they're really used to the Fed being like, don't worry, market, like don't cry, like we're gonna make it okay again. But that's no longer happening. And so the Federal Reserve, though, can't fix supply chains. Don't touch the slides. They can't fix supply chains. They can't make things better. And so that is part of their problem, where they can say, okay, like we're going to raise interest rates. We're going to make it harder for people to get a loan. That'll make it harder for them to buy a house. That'll make it harder for them to finance new purchases. But they can't really go and like fix things. They can only nudge. And that goes back to my point about the government, where like you have to have proper regulation, you have to have proper frameworks for incentives. But the Fed and what they've done, there's sort of a mismatch between the impact that they had and sort of the impact that they can have now. And that'll be really interesting to see how they respond, just because the market is freaking out, because we're starting to see a little bit of weakness in economic data. Unemployment numbers, it wasn't necessarily unemployment numbers, but you're starting to see a little bit of weakness in the jobs market, which is not good. So it's going to be really important how they respond. All right, and so this is the next slide, the compound impact. So everything that I've talked about is sort of, as I talked about earlier, like it's not that you can just go and fix production issues. It's not that you just can go fix water scarcity, fertilizer. Everything feeds into itself. So it's not as simple as like fix one thing and make it everything better again. Like you have this compound impact. And that's really part of the problem with like the food security issues, the market, everything. It's just like everything is everything, which sounds like very meta, I guess, but that is really part of the issue. And of course, like if you go and fix production issues, that's going to help down the line. But I think there's not a one-stop shop solution for this stuff. It's really going to have to be essentially a global effort to make sure that we're able to feed the world and produce things. And we're starting to see that rotation away from globalization. So it just could really, is a really interesting environment for having like these reverberating effects going on. And I think a core example of this, and this is more from the United States perspective, but like the baby formula shortage, it's a highly concentrated industry, which is just a huge red flag. Four companies control 90% of the market. And so Abbott had a plant shut down because of contamination, and that cuts into available supply because these baby formula makers were like, oh, don't worry, we're just gonna, concentrate all our production at these couple of plants. It's gonna be awesome. But it's not awesome when one of your plants shut down because all of a sudden you're losing out on X% of supply. And baby formula is for it's for babies. Like there's not another huge solution. Like there's of course breast milk, but like that's another difficult situation for mothers that maybe aren't able to produce that. And so formula is super, super important. And the United States pays for 50% of all formula through this thing called WIC. And Abbott, who's a company that had the plant shutdown, they have a monopoly on WIC. So they get a lot of government inflows support. I think it's in 2/3 of all states, they have this sort of monopoly on production. And the US and them are like buddy buddies, essentially. And that creates a lack of incentive for competition because it's like, oh, the United States is going to go pay for formula from Abbott. And that creates a lack of like willingness to enter the market, and it gets back into that incentive framework that I was talking about earlier, and that creates a lot of problems. And so a core issue is the monopoly. A core issue is the desire for profits, and that gets into this final point: the no imports because of profits. There's other reasons, of course, but like Europe does produce baby formula. That is an option, and we're starting to see the government be like, okay, like we can import now. Yeah, and that's like a whole different conversation, but like we're starting to see the government be like, yeah, we can import now, but historically it was like, oh no, we can't because profits, okay, like we have to protect this to a certain extent. And so I think that the way that we think of companies and the structures and the concentration is going to have to change. And I think if FTC was like, oh yeah, like this shouldn't have been the way that it was. That's not good that four companies control 90% of the market. Like we'll look into that. Like you're just going to have to see regulators move a little bit faster. But I mean, that gets into the other thing where you saw that the Fifth Circuit Court strike down the power of the SEC. And so there's just a lot of like moving variables across the board with all of this stuff. And so it's not a simple solution, but there is a way to not have such a highly concentrated industry. Yeah, don't touch the slides, please. Okay. Yeah, and so some more solutions. So what are some solutions? These are just some ideas. But basically, water management, different crops, different agricultural practices, and then of course innovation. So the UAE created the world's largest reserve of desalinated water underneath a desert, and that is a really good solution for having water access. You can also reuse wastewater, different crop varieties, so having drought-tolerant crops, financial transition support for farmers. So farmers actually get a little bit of support here in the United States in terms of subsidies, but like once again, that incentive framework, how can we make sure that incentives are aligned across the board in terms of producing as much good quality as you can versus, the incentive to maybe cut back on production. In terms of agricultural practices, different types of greenhouses, seawater farming, alternative protein sources. I know that's a little bit iffy, and you're starting to see that reflected in like Beyond Meat, but like salmon is a great protein source, and that is a little bit more carbon neutral versus beef. And so I think just shifting away from ag practices, but of course that's a whole different thing: vertical farming, hydroponics, etc. Innovation, improving logistics, improving supply chains, and I don't know, yeah, and then just investing in new agricultural technology. So just making sure that like we have a super good environment for encouraging people to go into this space, and like how do you incentivize people to want to go reinvent the way that we have food, go reinvent the way that we think about renewable energy, and what does that look like? And so I think that is just like a huge question. I don't know the answer to it, but I think that's another important point. Yeah, and then on the next slide, I have some sources. There's more sources in this, but I have a Notion doc if anyone can link you. But yeah, so these are some sources that I read for some of this stuff. And yeah, thanks so much. I don't know if there's a Q&A part of this, but that is my presentation.
Yes, hello, Kyla.
Hey.
Hi, this is Dr. Gaddis. I'm an associate professor of neurology at the University of South Florida. I just want to say that was a lovely presentation. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thanks.
I would like to invoke the late great Winston Churchill by saying, never waste a good crisis. And certainly the world is in crisis right now, or at least it's on the news every day. If you had one bit of advice for the rising generation who will likely be managing the consequences of our prior generations, what single piece of advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I'm 24, so I'm sort of part of that generation. And I think it's like, so I'm going to answer your question in two parts, because I think you're right. Like, it's really important to never waste a crisis. But I think that we see a lot of nihilism in this younger generation where people are like, I'm not super interested in fixing the world. It's kind of screwed over. And so I think that goes back to the point around like incentive frameworks. So you kind of have to be incentivized to explore different things, and you have to know that there's not going to be a lot of barriers. And so my one piece of advice would be like, if you're super passionate about something, you should go and try and figure out how you can solve that and how you can spend time on that. And maybe it's just like a side hustle. I don't want to say side hustle because hustle has a negative connotation, but like a side thing for a while. But like, if you really care about something, the world needs you doing that thing, and you should figure out how you can do that thing, even if it might be a little bit difficult. And that would be my advice, is like, you have to care, you know. Yeah.
Thank you. I agree.
Yeah, thanks.
If I could add one thing, in my years, I've discovered that there is always a lesson to be learned in history. So I would encourage everyone, look back. There is oftentimes or rarely a problem that no one has ever encountered or at least written about it. The answer often lies in a book.
Yes. Um, yeah, I mean, I think so. I don't really know what that would look like, so I don't want to like comment too much on what it looks like to produce your own electricity or to produce your own water supply. Um, a lot of the regulations around that stuff are pretty wacky and pretty intense, so I don't quite know what that would look like. But I do think there's efficiency in having an element of centralization, but then of course there's also risk to centralization, like we saw with the baby formula plant going out. So I think that there's things that could come from having more dispersed ways of living, but I also think that there's benefits from having centralized entities as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I was even reading about the food energy supply in Texas, right? So it was I think it was actually a podcast talking about the why the grid in Texas is actually finicky and sometimes fails. There were very famously documented blackouts throughout the history of Texas, and basically the regulation on centralizing energy production was associated with people wanting to have this somewhat freedom, and different companies were providing energy. It was kind of this way of you could go to an energy store and connect to that supplier in a way, and that kind of permeated through the regulations, and then the grid was built on that idea, right? And in that way, the idea of not having it centralized allowed for the system that maintained or could sustain the capacity of what it is today. So I think, well, just watching your presentation and watching you talk about this, I think there is somewhat of this balance, right? From you know the regulations, right? Talking about the regulations, how to open up the regulations so there is innovation and different suppliers in a way, but at the same time having this central order of commands that allows for things to be, well, not regulated, right? But somewhat in order and sustainable.
Yeah, totally. I think there's a lot of optionality around that for sure.
And just to point out that the floor is open. If anyone else has a question or any comments for Kyla, feel free to do so.
I actually, I don't know if I'll be able to formulate my question completely, but I was thinking about when you were talking about globalization and the supply chains, and yes, in India right now there's a massive heat wave going on, and yes, there's inflation going on itself in India itself, and we've stopped exports of wheat, as you said. Even during COVID, there was this thing where, and since then, India started becoming, our prime minister sort of gave out a call to the nation to become more self-reliant, to not, to create as much as we can within the country. And I guess I'm just thinking, countries are incentivized and because they're thinking about themselves and they're thinking about protecting its citizens not just from other countries and we see what is happening with Russia and Ukraine and what that has done to the global economy, but also by unforeseen things like COVID. Uh, wouldn't more and more countries be incentivized in the future to just try and be more self-reliant than trying and working together? I guess
Yeah,
is what.
yes, yes. That's like this idea of domestic protectionism, where countries are like, we don't really trust you anymore, and it's going to be easier for us to, try and produce stuff on our own. Maybe that's because supply chains are so bad because of rolling lockdowns, things like that. So I think we will start seeing a little bit more of that. Yeah, yeah, across the board, for sure.
Then what impact would that have on the world uh, or the world economy, let's say?
It's not great, and so kind of like what I was talking about in the presentation, it really bites into productivity. It really bites into growth. So if like you're a country that produces bread and you're doing trade with another country that's producing towels, if all of a sudden you have to start producing your own bread and towels, that's going to be doubly as difficult. You have to have, it's not necessarily double the labor, but you have to have double the resources potentially. You have to be able to do all of that stuff in house, and so it's just a diversion of resources towards things that you're just not as good at. And that, like I said, it hurts productivity, it hurts growth, and it just creates, unnecessary tension where there didn't necessarily have to be that. Yeah. And it also disincentivizes the incentive for countries to essentially get along with each other. So if you're no longer trade partners with X country, you're going to think a little bit less about fighting with them.
Well, I believe, if I may add, that that approach should not be approached in an absolute sense, meaning we shouldn't think of a country closing its borders entirely to the global market, but it should be approached strategically, if I may, saying, may we identify resources and goods that should be faced. We would be able to make things on our own. The main things, guns and butter, right? Energy, food, things like that. Maybe it's not wise to make those things, you become dependent on another country for those things. But in other more frivolous things like textiles and other parts of the supply chain, yes, you could maintain in a globalized world. Yes. And in that case, you might consider not something entirely decentralized and certainly not completely centralized, but more of a modular approach, which there are some, I believe, parallels in the world of architecture.
Yeah, totally. There's a balance for sure.
I have a question. Yeah. Do you think this incentivizes politicians over the next couple of years to do stuff like point fingers and say, we don't want to be the next Germany. We've seen what it's like to be energy independent and some of all the factors you mentioned today, which they would use that as kind of political currency to get elected. And then once elected, they kind of have to act on it. So it's this like cycle that eventually leads to more protectionism because it pays off to the political side of things. Do you think something like that's likely to happen?
I think it already happened. And regardless of how you vote, I mean, that's essentially what Trump kind of ran on. Was how do we get China out of the picture? So yeah, that happens. Will it continue to happen? Like with your example with Germany, I think that you do see some politicians being like renewables are bad because of what's happening in Europe. So I think that, of course, other countries and the decisions that other countries make are always going to be political currency for politicians to, work a certain narrative. I don't know how that will happen, but I do think that, you already see that happening. It kind of always happened, I suppose. But yeah, it's a good point and something to keep an eye out for. Yeah.
Yeah. And what about like corporations and just for-profit companies? Do you think they view this as fodder as well to either, I don't know, raise money, greenwash or market, use it as some sort of advantage for good PR or something like that?
That's this is probably like not the best thing to say, but that's what ESG is essentially, is like companies being like, we're good for the environment, and sometimes it's just not that good actually, and it's just fitting a certain framework. So I think, you know, ESG has to sort of sort that out on their end in terms of like how different, you know, different companies get voted into that sphere and asset managers allocate to them as such. That has to be worked out there. But yeah, I do think that you see people take advantage of labeling all the time for sure. Yeah.
Thanks. This was very insightful. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Yeah, no, thank you everybody. I'm gonna go, but this was super awesome. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Substack, YouTube, Kyla Scanlon on all platforms. So yeah, it was super nice to be here. Yeah, and appreciate it. Bye everybody.
Thank you.